The dust had not yet settled on the stage road when Julia Garner stepped off the coach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, and every man within 20 yards turned to look at her not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she was carrying a deed to 40 acres and wearing the expression of a woman who had already buried every doubt anyone had ever handed her. She was 24 years old, and she had come from Cincinnati, Ohio, where her mother had cried into a dish towel, and her brother had told her plainly that the Kansas frontier would kill her before her first winter. Her aunt had said the same. The women at her church had pulled her aside one by one and whispered variations of the same sentence, dressed up in different words but meaning exactly the same thing, that she was not built for it, that she was not strong enough, that the territory did not want women who came alone and had ideas above their station. Her former employer, a dry goods merchant named Hollis Pratt, had laughed outright when she told him she was leaving. He had said it in front of the other workers, loud enough that everyone could hear. He had said she would be back inside of 6 months with nothing to show for herself but calluses and heartbreak. She had not said a word to any of them. She had folded the deed into the inside pocket of her traveling coat, packed one trunk and one carpetbag, and boarded the eastbound train that would take her to the westbound connection at St. Louis. She had watched Cincinnati disappear through the window of the railcar, and she had felt something settle inside her chest like a stone dropping to the floor of a still lake. Not sadness, certainty. Caldwell in 1878 was a place in the middle of becoming something. The Kishom Trail ran right through it, and the cattle drives brought money and noise and trouble in roughly equal measure. The main street was mud when it rained and powder when it did not. There were 2 saloons, a hotel that doubled as a boarding house, a general store, a land office, a livery stable, a small church that still smelled of fresh-cut timber, and a barber shop where the barber also pulled teeth. It was loud, and it smelled of livestock and coal smoke and wood fire and leather, and Julia stood in the middle of it with her trunk at her feet and breathed it in like it was the first real air she had ever tasted. A woman named Agnes Polk ran the boarding house attached to the hotel. She was a stout woman in her 50s with flour on her apron, and a directness about her that Julia immediately respected. Agnes looked her over from the front porch without saying anything for a long moment, then said, "You coming in, or you planning to stand in the road until someone drives a cattle herd through you?" Julia picked up her carpetbag and walked up the steps. "You're the one that bought the Hennessy parcel," Agnes said. It was not a question. "I am," Julia said. "That land hasn't been worked in 2 years. The well needs clearing. The fence on the east side is down in 3 places. The barn roof took damage in the ice storm last February." "I know," Julia said. Agnes looked at her for another moment, then stood back and held the door open. "Room's $2 a week, supper at 6. I don't hold it if you're late." The boarding house was clean and the food was good, and Agnes, Julia quickly discovered, was not a woman who wasted words. She told Julia what she needed to know without ceremony, and she did not tell her that she couldn't do it, which was already more than most people had managed. She told Julia where to buy seed and where not to buy it, which men at the feed store would cheat her if she didn't watch the scales, and which ones were honest. She told her the road to her parcel was passable by wagon in dry weather and miserable in wet. She told her to get herself a good horse before she tried to get anything else. It was the horse that brought her to Walter Rourke. She went to the livery stable on her second morning in Caldwell because Agnes had told her that Bill Sutherland's stable was the best place in town for an honest price on a working horse, though she had also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a man named Walter Rourke sometimes kept a remuda of horses in the corral behind Sutherland's place, and that his animals were better trained than anything Sutherland sold outright. The morning was cool and sharp, the sky the particular shade of blue that only seems to exist in the middle of the country in spring, wide and unmediated by anything. Julia walked from the boarding house to the stable with her coat buttoned and her purpose clear, and she heard the horses before she saw them. She came around the side of the stable to the back corral and stopped at the fence. There were 8 horses in the pen, various colors and builds, and they were moving quietly, not nervous the way horses sometimes are when they've been roughly handled. A man was in the pen with them, not chasing them but standing still near the center, letting a red roan mare come to him on the mare's own terms. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, probably in his early 30s, wearing worn canvas trousers and a faded blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cool air. He had his hat in his hands rather than on his head, which struck Julia as unusual. He was watching the mare with a quality of attention that she recognized, the kind that is not performance but genuine interest. The mare touched her nose to his outstretched hand. He let her smell him, then slowly moved his hand up to her jaw, and the mare did not pull back. Julia stayed at the fence without speaking because she did not want to startle the horses, and she watched for a few minutes until the man became aware of her presence without her doing anything to announce it. He turned slowly, the way a person does when they've been conscious of being watched for a little while, but waited to acknowledge it, and he looked at her across the pen. His face was weathered in the way that faces become weathered out here, lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into distances. His eyes themselves were a gray-green color, the color of sage in certain lights, and they were looking at her with a straightforwardness that was not rude and not bold but simply present. He did not look her up and down the way some men did, cataloging her as if she were livestock. He looked at her face. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "I'm looking for Walter Rourke." "You found him. I was told you might have a horse for a working farm." He came toward the fence at an easy pace, the roan following him for a few steps before losing interest and going back to the other horses. He rested his forearms on the top rail and looked at her with the same unhurried attention he'd been giving the mare. "What kind of working farm?" he asked. "I have 40 acres on the Hennessy parcel east of town. I'm going to run cattle eventually, but first I need to get the place in order. I need a horse that can do everything, pulling a plow if I need it, riding fence lines, reliable enough that I'm not fighting it every morning." He nodded slowly, thinking it through. He did not say anything about the farm or about her owning it. He did not say anything about her doing it alone, which was clearly implied by the fact that she was standing there by herself making her own inquiries. He simply took what she'd said at face value and worked with the information she'd given him. "The gray gelding in the back corner," he said after a moment. 5 years old, sound feet, has been worked both ways. He's not flashy, but he'll do what you need. Can I ride him?" "That's the idea," he said, and moved to open the gate. They spent an hour that morning working the gray gelding, whose name, Walter told her, was Pemberton, though he admitted no particular logic behind it. Julia rode well, which Walter noted without comment beyond a single brief nod, when she put the horse through a tight turn without pulling too hard on the reins. They came back to the corral, and she dismounted and ran her hands along the gelding's legs the way she'd taught herself to do from a book she'd read about horses in the months before she left Cincinnati, checking for heat or swelling. $22, Walter said. It was fair. She knew enough to know it was fair. She paid him and led the gelding back to the boarding house stable, and that should have been the end of it, a simple transaction on her second day in Caldwell. But the next morning she drove out to her parcel in a hired wagon she'd arranged through Bill Sutherland, and by the time she reached the property and climbed down to look it over, the weight of it hit her all at once. Not doubt, she was very clear about that with herself. It was not doubt, but the sheer physical scale of what she had taken on. The farmhouse was small and needed work, but was structurally sound. The barn was worse than she'd imagined. The fence on the east side was not down in 3 places but in 6. The well had not just settled, it had a crack in the stone lining that would need a mason. The kitchen garden was so overgrown that she could not see where the rows had been. She sat on the porch step of that farmhouse for a long time, looking at it all, doing the arithmetic of it in her head. The arithmetic of time and money and labor and what she was able to do herself and what she would need to hire out. She was not crying. She was thinking. but she was thinking with her whole body, the kind of thinking that feels like sitting at the bottom of something very deep. She heard a horse on the road and looked up. Walter Rourke was riding past on a dark bay, apparently heading somewhere east, and he slowed when he saw the wagon parked in front of the farmhouse. He looked over the fence at her sitting on the step with her hands on her knees. "Problem with Pemberton?" he asked. "No," she said. "Pemberton is fine. I'm just looking at everything that needs doing." He looked out over the property for a moment, his horse still and patient beneath him. He said, "The east fence is the most pressing. If you're planting cattle, you need that line solid before anything else." He paused. "I know a hand who does good fence work at a fair rate. Name is Sam Greer. He's at the Dorchester Ranch most days, but he takes extra work." "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He did not tell her it was a lot for one person. He did not tell her she'd taken on more than she could handle. He pointed toward the well and said, "The crack in that stone lining is manageable, but you'll want the Mason Brothers on Commerce Street before you try to use it. Don't drink from it until then." And then he touched his hat brim and rode on east. She watched him go and felt something she couldn't quite put a name to. It was the absence of a thing she'd come to expect. She kept waiting for the qualifier, the hesitation in his voice that came right before the part where he expressed his doubts about her enterprise or her judgment, and it did not come. He had spoken to her the way you speak to a competent neighbor, sharing practical information because it was useful, not because he was trying to take care of her or steer her away from something he thought was too big for her. She went and hired Sam Greer the next morning. She spoke to the Mason brothers about the well that afternoon. She began making a list. The weeks that followed were the hardest of her life and also the most clarifying. She rose before sunrise every day and worked until her hands ached and the light was gone. She learned quickly that there was a gap between having read about farming in books and the actual physical practice of it, but she also learned that the gap was closable through sheer repetition and willingness to be bad at something until she was better at it. She planted her kitchen garden. She got the well repaired. She had the barn roof patched by a crew she hired from town. She started conversations at the general store and at Agnes's boarding house table with anyone who could tell her something useful, and she listened more than she spoke. She saw Walter Rourke around Caldwell fairly regularly in those weeks because Caldwell was not a large town, and people with regular business there tended to cross paths. She saw him at the general store one morning, and he told her about a source for good seed corn at a price lower than what Wilson's store was charging. She saw him at the land office one afternoon, and he said hello and asked how the east fence was holding up. She saw him at the farrier with Pemberton one day, and he checked the gelding's shoes without being asked, and told her the rear left was going to need replacing within the month. He was helpful in the way that people who know things are helpful when they aren't precious about their knowledge. He shared information without making her feel like she was receiving charity. And he never, not once, in any of those small exchanges, said anything that suggested he found her presence on that land surprising or inadvisable. She noticed this the way you notice a sound that has been absent. She kept waiting for it, and it kept not arriving. It was Agnes who told her a little more about him over supper one evening in late April, when Julia had been in Caldwell about 6 weeks. Agnes had a way of providing information about people without quite seeming to gossip, delivering it in her brisk, efficient manner as if it were just another useful fact about the county. Walter Rourke, Agnes said, was 31 years old. He had come to Kansas from Missouri about 5 years back. He had worked cattle drives on the Kishom Trail for 3 seasons and had spent the last 2 years building his own operation, a modest ranch about 7 miles north of town, running a modest herd and buying and training horses on the side. He was regarded as honest by everyone who dealt with him, which was a more meaningful recommendation in Caldwell, Agnes implied, than it might have been elsewhere. He was not married, had not been married. Agnes said this without looking up from her plate, which Julia recognized as the way Agnes said things she knew were relevant. "I'm not looking for a husband," Julia said. I didn't say you were, Agnes said. Julia went back to her supper. She thought about Walter Rourke standing in the middle of that pen, with the roan mare coming to him on her own terms. She thought about the way he had looked at her at the fence, just at her face, with that simple, unhurried attention. She thought about all the things he had not said. She did not go looking for him. That was not her way, and it was not what she needed in those months, with so much work still to do on the land. But Caldwell had its rhythms, and she fell into them, and its rhythms kept bringing her into proximity with him. The thing that changed between them, that moved the sum of small, helpful encounters into something with a different quality, happened in May, on an afternoon when she was at Wilson's General Store picking up supplies, and she overheard, around a corner of stacked goods, a conversation between two men she did not know. They were talking about her, though they did not know she was in the store. She had come in quietly and they had not seen her. Their voices were low, but the store was small and the words carried. They were discussing the Hennessy parcel and who had bought it. One of them said something about a woman alone trying to run a farm on that land. The other one laughed and said something that included the words, "won't last a season," and "waste of good land." The first one said he didn't know why women got ideas like that in their heads, that the territory was no place for someone who didn't know what they'd gotten into. Julia stood still in the aisle with a can of coffee in her hand and let the words go over her without allowing them to take root, because she had heard this same sentence in so many forms from so many people since she'd announced her intention to come here that she had developed something like immunity to it. She was not hurt. She was tired. There was a difference. She had been tired of this sentence for the better part of the last year. She came around the corner to the counter and set down her goods, and Mr. Wilson tallied them up without comment, and the two men in question fell quiet in a way that told her they knew she had heard them. She did not look at them. She paid for her goods and carried them out. Walter Rourke was at his horse at the hitch rail outside. He had clearly just arrived. He glanced at her face as she came out the door, and something in her expression must have told him something, because he looked at her for a moment with a kind of quiet attention, not prying, just present. She set her goods in the wagon bed, and he said quietly, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. Then, because she was tired, and because he was someone who had never added to the weight of what she was carrying, she said, "I just heard myself described as a situation that will not work out." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and there was something in them that was not pity and not false reassurance and not empty comfort. He said, "Some people in this town have been wrong about a lot of things. I'd take it as a recommendation." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that directness that was not forward but was simply honest. She felt something move in her chest, something warm and a little frightening. "Thank you," she said. He touched his hat brim. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins and drove east toward her land, and she could feel him still standing there at the hitch rail as she went, watching her go, not with doubt but with something that might have been, she could not be certain. She told herself not to read into it, something that might have been hope. June came, and with it the heat. The Kansas summer was not gradual. It arrived all at once like a door opened to an oven, and Julia learned to start working before sunrise and stop in the worst hours of the afternoon and begin again as the sun dropped. Her kitchen garden was producing now, the beans coming in thick and the squash spreading across the ground and the tomatoes just beginning to set fruit. She had bought 2 milk cows and they were settled in the barn. She had a plan for buying her first cattle in the fall, and she had spoken to 3 men who would be driving herds up from Texas about what she would need, taking notes on everything. She was becoming known in town. Not famous, but known, in the way that people become known in small places as a reliable presence, someone whose word meant what it said, someone who showed up. The women in town were, for the most part, cautious about her at first, but Agnes Polk's quiet endorsement carried weight, and over the weeks several of them became something like friends. A woman named Clara Hendricks, who ran the millinery with her husband Thomas, was the one who sought Julia out first, inviting her to the Thursday evening church socials. And Julia went because Clara was warm-hearted, and because the socials were a good place to learn things. Walter Rourke was not a man who attended church socials, but Clara's husband Thomas knew him and regarded him highly. And Thomas, Julia discovered, was a very social person who talked freely about his acquaintances. She learned from Thomas that Walter had been the one to help pull a family's wagon out of a creek, crossing the previous fall when the current had been high. She learned that Walter had lent seed to a neighboring farmer named Broderick, when Broderick's entire supply had been ruined by a rat infestation over the winter, asking nothing in return except for Broderick to pay it forward when he had the chance. She learned that Walter had been among the first to volunteer when the new church had needed its roof timbers raised. None of this surprised her. It fit perfectly with the man she was coming to know in pieces and glimpses. What surprised her, a little, was how much she thought about him. It was not something she had planned. She had come to Kansas with such a singular concentration on her land and her project that there had not been room for anything else, and she had been glad of it, glad to have a purpose large enough to fill the whole frame of her attention. But Walter Rourke had a way of slipping into her thoughts at odd moments, when she was working in the garden in the early morning or riding the fence lines on Pemberton in the long evenings. She thought about the things he said and the things he didn't say. She thought about the way he moved around horses, with that stillness that was not passivity but a very active form of patience. She told herself it was simply gratitude or admiration. She told herself she was not in a position to be distracted by romantic feelings, not in her first year, not with so much depending on her staying focused and clear-headed. She told herself these things with diminishing conviction as June became July. In July, there was a problem. Her east fence, repaired in April by Sam Greer, had come down again, not from disrepair but because someone had cut it. She found 3 sections cut clean on a Monday morning when she rode the line after a weekend of rain, the wire lying on the ground with ends that were too neat to be accidental breakage. She didn't know who had done it or why. She did not make accusations. She reported it to the Caldwell marshal, a reasonable man named Hendricks, no relation to Thomas and Clara, who told her he'd look into it. He had the manner of a man who did not expect to find much and was managing her expectations accordingly. She repaired the fence herself this time because she had learned how. She rode the east line every morning for a week afterward, and on the 3rd morning she found that another section had been cut overnight. She was sitting on Pemberton at the cut fence, looking at it, when she heard another horse on the road and looked up to find Walter Rourke riding toward her. He was coming from the east from the direction of his ranch on his way to town. He saw her sitting there at the fence and turned off the road and came across the grass. He looked at the cut wire for a long moment without speaking. His jaw was tight in a way that she had not seen on him before. "Second time?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "3rd section this month." He was quiet. He looked east, then west, then back at the fence. "You have any trouble with anyone in particular since you came here?" he asked. He was asking it carefully, not making assumptions. "Not that I know of," she said, "though I overheard 2 men at Wilson's store in May talking about my land being wasted." She paused. "I didn't know them. What did they look like?" She described them as best she could, and he nodded slowly. He said, "I think I might know who one of them is. A man named Cutter Ames. He's been trying to accumulate land east of town for 2 years. He makes offers, and if they're refused, he gets difficult. The Hennessy parcel was on the market for 8 months before I bought it," she said, "because Ames was trying to buy it for less than it was worth and the estate wouldn't settle for his price," Walter said. "And then you came along and paid fair value." He looked at her. "He's not a dangerous man, but he's a petty one, which is sometimes more trouble in the long run." She took that in. She was not afraid exactly, but she was angry in the particular way that injustice produces anger, clean and cold, and without any of the heat that dissipates quickly. "I'm going to fix the fence again," she said, "and I'm going to keep fixing it. I'm not going to be run off my own land by someone cutting wire." Walter looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he said, "I'll ride your east line on my way to and from town for a while if that's agreeable to you. I come past this road most days anyway. It's no extra trouble." She looked at him. She was not a woman who easily accepted help, because accepting help had so often come with conditions or with the implication that you needed it because you were insufficient. But his offer came with neither of those things attached. It was simply practical, and it was offered in the same tone he used when he told her where to buy good seed corn. "That's agreeable," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and they parted ways, and over the following weeks he rode her east line on his way past and nothing was cut again. Whether this was coincidence or deterrence, she never knew for certain. Marshall Hendricks had a conversation with Cutter Ames that produced no admissions but apparently had some effect. Ames left her alone after that, at least with respect to the fence. It was the fence trouble that shifted something in the way she and Walter spoke to each other. Up until that point their conversations had been practical, useful, valuable in the way that good information is valuable, but without much personal weight. After the fence, they began to talk more. When he stopped at her east line on his morning rides, sometimes they would talk for 20 minutes before he went on into town. She asked him questions about cattle because he knew cattle and she needed to know, and he answered them fully, not simplified for her benefit but the real answer. And then he began asking her questions about her plans for the farm, what she wanted it to be in 3 years, in 5, and his questions were genuinely interested rather than polite. She told him about Cincinnati. Not everything, not immediately, but in pieces over several mornings. She told him about the dry goods store and Holly's Pratt's laughter, and about her mother's dish towel and her brother's certainty. She told him she had been planning this since she was 19, since she had read a land notice in a newspaper at the bottom of a stack at the shop, and something in her had snapped awake. He listened to all of this without saying much, which was one of the things she had come to value about him. He was not performing listening. He was actually listening, taking things in. And when she reached the part about Holly's Pratt laughing, his expression changed, not to anger, though it was close to anger, but to something more considered than that. He said, "People who laugh at what someone else can do generally do it because they can't imagine doing it themselves." She looked at him across the fence. The morning was clear and the grass was very green, and somewhere in the tree line to the south a bird was singing steadily into the warm air. "You've never done that," she said. "Not once, from the first morning at the corral." He seemed slightly surprised that she'd said it directly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "It never occurred to me to." She absorbed that. She looked down at her hands on Pemberton's reins and then back up at him. He was looking at her with that expression she had come to recognize as his real face, the one beneath the composed surface he wore in general company, the one that was warmer and more open. She felt the thing in her chest that she had been explaining to herself as gratitude or admiration shift into something she could no longer misidentify. It was unmistakably particular and unmistakably strong, and it frightened her a little, not because it was unwelcome, but because she had not given herself permission for it and was not sure she should now. She touched her hat and said she needed to get on with the morning, and he said of course, and they parted as they always did, and she rode back toward the farmhouse thinking with great concentration about her cattle plan, and trying very hard not to think about Walter Rourke, with the partial success that serious effort at not thinking about something generally produces. August came and the heat was immense, and the work was unrelenting, and she was happy. This was the thing that surprised her about the territory. Not the hardness of it, she had expected the hardness, but the happiness. The mornings when she stood on her own porch with her own coffee and looked out over her own land, and the sky was enormous overhead, and the grass was moving, and everything she could see was something she had built or maintained or coaxed into being through her own effort. The satisfaction of that was unlike anything she had known before, and it was not diminished by exhaustion or physical difficulty. It was, in fact, clarified by them. Clara Hendricks had become a true friend by August, the kind you could sit on a porch with in the evening and say real things to. One evening Clara came out to the farm for supper and they sat on the porch afterward while the sky turned colors over the western flats, and Clara said without preamble, "Walter Rourke looks at you like you hung the moon, Julia." Julia said, "You're imagining things." Clara said, "I am absolutely not imagining things. Thomas says he's never seen Walter talk as much as he talks these days, and Thomas says it's quite obvious why." Julia was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the orange fade out of the sky. "I didn't come here for that," she said. "I came here for this." She gestured at the land. "You can have both," Clara said. "People always say that." "I say it because it's true, not just because it's the thing to say." Clara looked at her sideways. "Do you like him?" Julia thought about Walter at the corral fence with the mare's nose in his hand. She thought about him saying, "It never occurred to me to." She thought about his gray-green eyes and his particular stillness and the way he made her feel, the strange paradox of him making her feel both fully seen and completely free. "Yes," she said carefully. "I like him." Clara smiled in a way that contained significant satisfaction and wisely said nothing more about it that evening. But the conversation had named the thing, and once named it was harder to set aside. She found herself more acutely aware of him in the days that followed, of the mornings when he stopped at the fence line, of the occasional evenings when she saw him in town, and their conversations lingered longer than was strictly necessary. She noticed that he was beginning to stop at the farm itself rather than just at the fence, finding small practical reasons, asking if Pemberton had been showing any tenderness in that rear left foot, stopping to point out that the roofing over the south side of the barn porch was starting to curl. These were real observations with real utility, but they were also reasons to stop, and she was aware of that, and she was fairly certain he was aware that she was aware, and the whole business was creating in her a constant low-level distraction that she found annoying and wonderful in equal measure. It was in late August, on a hot Sunday afternoon when the whole country seemed to be holding its breath in the heat, that something shifted properly. She had ridden Pemberton out to check the north fence line, a longer ride that took her through a stand of cottonwood trees by the creek, and coming back through the trees she found Walter at the creek, his horse drinking. He had dismounted and was sitting on the bank with his boots off, feet in the water, hat beside him, and he had clearly thought himself alone because he looked up with genuine surprise when she came through the trees. For a moment they just looked at each other, and in the middle of that moment something changed in the air between them, some quality of the light or the sound or the particular arrangement of the afternoon. He was looking at her in a way that was different from his usual look, not composed but open, with all the careful neutral surface gone, and it was the most direct and readable thing she had ever seen in a person's face. She climbed down from Pemberton and let him drink beside Walter's horse at the creek, and she sat down on the bank a couple of feet from Walter and took her own boots off and put her feet in the water because it was hot and the water was cold and it was the most sensible thing in the world to do. "Hot day," she said. "Yes," he said. They sat in silence for a little while. The water moved over the rocks and the cottonwood leaves made their dry rattling sound in the small breeze, and somewhere a crow called twice and stopped. "Julia," Walter said, and stopped. He said her name differently from how he'd been saying it. He'd been saying it the way you say someone's name when you mean to get their attention. He said it this time the way you say it when the name is the whole thing you want to say and you're building up to the rest of it. She turned and looked at him. "I have been trying," he said, "to find a way to say something to you for about 6 weeks that doesn't come out sounding like something I don't mean, or like I'm asking you to be less than what you are." He stopped and turned the brim of his hat in his hands the way she'd noticed he did when he was choosing his words carefully. "I'm not a man who talks around things very well, so I'll just say it plain. I think you are extraordinary." I think about you more than I can account for. And I don't want to presume anything, because you came here to do something important, and you're doing it well, and the last thing I want is to be one more person who gets in the way of that." She looked at him. He was looking down at the water now, at his feet in the current, and his jaw was slightly tense with the vulnerability of having said the thing plainly. "Walter," she said. He looked up. "You are the first person I met in this territory who treated my being here as a fact rather than a problem to be managed." She kept looking at him steadily. "Do you know what that did to me? Not just practically, but—" She paused, finding the right word. "It was like being allowed to breathe all the way down, like I'd been breathing half full since I was 19 years old, and then I arrived here and you just spoke to me like I was already what I was trying to become." He was very still. The creek ran over the rocks between their feet. "I don't know how to not be busy," she said. "I don't know how to make promises about time I don't have. But I know what I feel when you ride up to that fence in the morning, and I know it's not just gratitude." She paused. "I'm telling you plainly because you told me plainly." He reached over slowly and took her hand where it was resting on her knee and held it in both of his with a gentleness that made her eyes sting unexpectedly. His hands were rough and warm and completely steady. "I'm not asking for time you don't have," he said. "I'm just asking for whatever this is." "Then you have it," she said. They sat by the creek in the August heat with their feet in the cold water and his hands around hers, and neither of them said anything more for a long time, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, but the most comfortable one Julia had ever known. The thing between them after that was not a sudden storm but a deepening river. They did not suddenly see each other every day. Both of them had too much work for that, but the quality of the time they spent together changed. There was a claiming to it now, a mutuality, something that named itself without requiring constant discussion. Walter began helping on the farm on Sunday afternoons, not because she needed managing, but because he had skills she was glad of, and because working alongside someone you love is its own distinct pleasure, and she had begun to understand, by September, that what she felt for him qualified as love. She was not afraid of the word. She had not been afraid of much since Cincinnati. She went to his ranch for the first time in September. It was 7 miles north, and she rode Pemberton out on a clear Saturday morning with a cold front moving in from the northwest, the sky going pale and silvery at the edges. His ranch was modest in the way that honest things are modest, nothing excessive, everything well considered. The house was small but sturdy, better built than most in the county, with a stone chimney and a good porch. The corral held 6 horses currently. The barn was sound. There were 30 cattle in the north pasture, good healthy animals. He showed her around without ceremony, walking beside her, pointing things out not with the pride of a man showing off but with the thoughtfulness of a man sharing something that mattered to him. She could see what it had taken to build this, the years of it, the accumulated work. She stood at the pasture fence and looked at his cattle and said, "You built all this in 5 years." "Yes," he said. "From nothing." "Close enough to it," he said. "I had 2 horses and a good reputation, and about $140 when I got here." She thought about the $140. She thought about what she had arrived with, which was the deed, and about $200 of savings and a furious determination. She thought about how 2 people could both arrive in a territory with almost nothing and build something from it, side by side, each on their own terms. "What made you come here?" she asked. "To Kansas." He was quiet for a moment. He turned to lean back against the fence rail, facing away from the cattle, facing the wide southern sky. "Missouri got complicated," he said. He said it in a way that was not evasive, but contained a weight of meaning she did not press. Later, over weeks and pieces, she would come to understand what Missouri had been: a family situation, a father who had been a difficult and domineering man, a younger brother who needed looking after and was now happily doing well in St. Louis. It was not a dramatic story, but it was a real one, and Walter told it the same way he did everything, with no embellishment and no omission of the honest parts. "This land," he said, looking at the sky, "doesn't care what you came from." It cares what you do with what you've got." He turned and looked at her. "You knew that when you came here." "I did," she said. He reached over and tucked a piece of her hair back that had come loose from under her hat. A slow, deliberate touch, and she leaned into it slightly the way a person does when they have stopped pretending that they don't want the contact. They ate supper at his kitchen table that evening. A simple meal he had cooked himself with the competence of someone who has been feeding himself for a long time. And the cold front arrived while they ate, and the wind came up, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees by the time they finished. The way Kansas weather does, dramatic and immediate. She stayed longer than she'd planned because the weather warranted it, and they sat by the fire in the front room and talked for hours, the kind of talking that finds its own level and goes deep without effort. She rode home under a sky full of stars so thick and sharp that the night was bright with them. Wrapped in her heavy coat, Pemberton steady and reliable under her. She searched for the word and found it. She felt chosen. Not in the way she'd been afraid of. Not chosen to be managed or protected or redirected, but chosen as herself, specifically and fully, by someone who had seen exactly what she was and wanted all of it. October brought the cattle she had been planning for. She bought 20 head from a Texas drover at the end of a drive, negotiated the price herself, and drove them back to her property with the help of 2 hired hands she brought on for the week. It was the culmination of 6 months of work and planning, and she stood at her corral fence that first evening watching her cattle settle in, and she was almost overcome by it. Not sentiment, it was more muscular than sentiment. It was proof. Walter rode over that evening because he had heard the drive was coming in. He stood at the fence beside her and looked at her cattle and said, "Good animals." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. The evening light was orange and warm on everything, and she could see him looking at her with that warmth she had come to know as his particular warmth for her, specific and steady. "6 months ago you stepped off a stagecoach into a muddy street," he said. 7 months, she said. "I arrived in March." He smiled. It was not his frequent expression. He was not a man of easy smiles, which was exactly why it meant what it meant. It was full and unguarded, and it transformed his face in a way that still moved her every time she saw it. She turned from the fence and looked up at him and said, "I would very much like you to kiss me, Walter." He looked at her for a moment with that particular stillness of his, and then he did. He kissed her softly and thoroughly, and with none of the hesitation of someone uncertain of their welcome, because by this point they were both very certain. She put her hand on the front of his coat and felt his arms come around her, and the cattle moved and settled in the corral, and the sky above Kansas went from orange to violet to the first pale stars. November was cold and productive. Walter helped her winterize the barn, and she helped him move his cattle to the south pasture, where the windbreak was better. They worked on each other's properties with the easy collaboration of 2 people who have stopped keeping score, because the keeping of score has ceased to feel necessary. Agnes Polk, who had been watching the whole progression with what she probably thought was concealed satisfaction, told Julia one evening at supper that she looked well, and said it with a private smile that Julia found simultaneously knowing and dear. There was a community harvest supper at the church in early November, one of the significant social events of the Caldwell year, and Walter came with Julia. This was the first time they appeared together in a fully public social context as a pair, and Julia was aware of the shift in how people looked at them, the new way of reading their presence side by side. She was aware of some surprise in certain faces, the small recalibrations of people who had been filing them as separate entities. She stood at the supper table filling a plate, and a man she did not know well, a farmer from the western side of the county, said to her with a friendliness that was also slightly condescending, the kind that is never entirely sure whether it's speaking to a capable adult, "Well, you've made a go of it more than most would have predicted." She held his gaze pleasantly and said, "Yes." Walter had come up behind her, and she felt his presence at her shoulder and heard him say, mildly but with a clarity that landed, I think it's about what anyone would have predicted who'd actually met her. And then he passed her the bread plate and the moment moved on, and she thought she might love him more for that than for any single thing except the original thing, the first day at the corral when he had spoken to her as if she were already who she was. By December she had made it through her first full year if you counted from when she'd begun planning in earnest, and she had made it through her first approaching winter in Kansas with her land intact, and her cattle healthy and her house snug with good firewood and a good kitchen stove, and a kitchen garden that had been put up properly for the cold months. She had proved every qualifier wrong. Not loudly, not with announcement, but in the only way that matters, which is by simply continuing. On a December evening, 2 days before Christmas, Walter came to her farm in the early evening with his coat collar up against the cold, and snow starting to fall in small, dry flakes that the wind moved sideways. She let him in and built the fire up and made coffee, and they sat at her kitchen table the way they had spent many evenings since September, easy in each other's company in a way that had long since stopped feeling new. He put his hands around his coffee cup and looked at them for a moment, and then he looked up at her and he said, "I have been thinking about something I want to ask you, and I want to ask it in a way that is clear so there's no confusion about what I mean." She waited. She was not a person who rushed people past their words. "I want to marry you," he said, "not to take anything from you, not to change anything about what you've built here or what you intend to build. I want to marry you because you are the person I want to be beside for the rest of my life, and because I think we are better together than we are separately, though I think we're both fairly competent separately." He paused. "I want to be your partner. I want us to build something together that belongs to both of us. But I will not ask you to give anything up or fold yourself into something smaller." She looked at him across the table in the warm light of her own kitchen in the farmhouse on her own land, and she felt that same thing she had felt on the first morning at the corral, a recognition, and now it had a year's worth of evidence behind it. "Yes," she said. He looked at her, his expression still composed but his eyes very bright. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "Walter, yes." He reached across the table and took her hand. Outside, the snow was falling more steadily now, covering the Kansas winter in white, and the fire crackled behind them, and the coffee steamed between their hands, and Julia Garner, who had come to the territory to outlast every person who had ever said she would not make it, said yes to the only person who had never said it at all. They were married in February of 1879, in the small Caldwell church that still smelled faintly of fresh timber, with Agnes Polk in the front pew with flour on her apron that she hadn't noticed, and Clara and Thomas Hendricks beside her, and a handful of others who had come to know Julia over her 9 months in the territory. Sam Greer was there, the fence hand who had done that first East Line repair, and Bill Sutherland from the livery, and the Mason brothers who had fixed her well. It was a plain ceremony without elaborate adornment, 2 people saying true things in front of witnesses, and Julia wore a dark blue dress she had made herself from good wool fabric she'd bought in town, practical and handsome, which was more or less how she approached most things. Walter said his vows in the level, careful way he said things he meant, which was the way he said most things. When the minister reached the end and told him he could kiss his bride, he kissed her with a contained passion that made Clara Hendricks lean over to Agnes and whisper something, and Agnes made a sound that was as close as she ever came to giggling. After, they had supper at the church hall, which half the town turned out for because people in Caldwell liked an occasion. There was food and music, a fiddle player from the saloon end of town who turned out to have genuine skill, and Julia danced with Walter and then with Thomas Hendricks, and then with old Bill Sutherland who was surprisingly light on his feet, and she felt something she had not felt since she was very young, before the weight of other people's doubt had settled on her. She felt entirely herself, and also, for the first time, perfectly matched. They went to his ranch that night, which had become their ranch by simple extension of the conversation they had been having since December about how to combine their operations most sensibly. The plan they had worked out was good, built on both their strengths, Walter's cattle experience and her organizational precision, and her kitchen garden and her particular stubbornness, which he had come to regard as one of her most essential qualities. Spring came again, the second spring, and the combined operation began to take shape. They hired 2 hands, good workers they had both vetted carefully, and with 4 people instead of 1, the larger tasks became manageable in a different way. They drove additional cattle up from Texas in the spring sale and expanded the herd. Julia's farm, which was legally still hers and remained so, was folded into the larger plan as its own distinct piece, and she rode out to it regularly because it was hers and always would be, and she felt that pride in it undiminished. Walter had told her in the winter, quietly one evening by the fire, that he had been aware of the Cutter Ames situation, beyond what he had mentioned that Ames had made a disparaging comment about Julia in the saloon sometime the previous summer. Something dismissive about a woman trying to run a farm being a curiosity that wouldn't last. Walter said that he had responded to this comment in the saloon, briefly and without theater, by saying that he expected she would outlast most people in the territory and that further commentary of that kind from Ames would be unwelcome. Ames had been quiet. Julia listened to this and said, "You could have told me." Walter said, "I thought about it. I didn't want you to feel like you needed looking after." She looked at him for a moment. "That's the right reason," she said. "But I want you to always tell me things." "All right," he said, and he did after that. Cutter Ames left Caldwell in the fall of 1879, having failed to build the land operation he'd attempted, and the talk around town was that he'd gone east again, which suited everyone including Julia well enough. The land east of town was taken up by people who had earned it and stayed in it, and that was how it should have been from the start. In the summer of 1879, Julia discovered she was pregnant. She told Walter one morning when they were riding out together to check the north fence line, riding side by side through the tall grass with the early sun still low and gold behind them. She just said it, straight out, the way she said most things. She turned and looked at him, and he looked back at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something that cracked open the careful composure entirely and left behind something almost luminous. He said her name, just her name, and then he leaned over from his saddle and put his hand on the side of her face, and she held his hand against her face and felt the warmth of it in the cool morning air. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said. "Are you? How do you feel about it?" He asked it with the care he always brought to the important questions, not assuming the answer. She thought about it honestly. She had not come to Kansas looking for this. She had come looking for land and for independence and for the chance to prove something. She had found all of those things, and then also this man and this life, and now this new thing growing in the frame of everything she'd built. "I feel like it fits," she said. "Like it fits inside everything else, not outside it." He exhaled slowly, like a man who'd been holding his breath without knowing it. He said, "Then that's how I feel about it too." The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which she was grateful for, and she worked all the way through it because she was someone who worked and because the doctor in Caldwell, a young man named Elias Fry, who had come west 2 years prior with both skill and an absence of the paternalistic assumptions of some of his profession, told her that there was no reason a healthy pregnant woman who felt well couldn't continue her normal activities with appropriate modifications. He said this to both her and Walter together, which she appreciated, because she had half expected a performance about delicate conditions that she would have had to firmly address. The baby was born in March of 1880, exactly 2 years after Julia had stepped off the stage in Caldwell with the deed in her coat pocket. It was a boy, healthy and loud, with Walter's gray-green eyes and Julia's evident determination from his very first hour, fighting his way into the world with a ferocity that made the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. O'Ford, say that this one was going to keep his parents on their toes. They named him James Henry Rourke, James for no particular person and Henry for Walter's younger brother Incent. Louis, whom Walter wrote to with the news and who wrote back a letter of such warm enthusiasm that Julia, reading it at the kitchen table, felt something ease in her about the family she'd been less familiar with. Agnes Polk came to see the baby 3 days after the birth and held him in her flower-dusted arms with the tenderness of a woman who had never had children of her own but had been mother-adjacent to more of them than she could count, and said, "He's got good eyes," which from Agnes was essentially a poem. Clara Hendricks came with Thomas and a covered dish and sat with Julia on the porch in the mild March sun, while Thomas went with Walter to look at the new calf that had arrived the same week as the baby, which Walter seemed to find appropriately symmetrical. Clara held the baby and said, "Do you remember what you told me when I said Walter looked at you like you hung the moon?" "I said I wasn't looking for a husband," Julia said. "And now look," Clara said. "And now look," Julia agreed, without any irony, with entirely genuine warmth. The years after that moved with the rhythm of a life well built and actively lived. The operation grew because they were both disciplined and creative, and because the territory was, in those years, a place where disciplined and creative people could build something real. Walter expanded the cattle herd and the horse training business. Julia's farm produced steadily, and she began selling her surplus kitchen garden produce, then her milk, then, after 2 years of research and one failed attempt and one successful one, a small operation producing pressed cider from apple trees she had planted in the first season and which were now old enough to bear. She had a reputation in Caldwell by now that was as solid as any person's in the county. She was known as someone whose handshake meant something, as someone who paid on time and expected the same, as someone whose opinion was worth having and whose memory for a detail was formidable. She served for 2 years on a committee of residents organized to advocate for improved water access in the county. She was involved in the planning of the new schoolhouse that went up in 1881. Walter was the same man at 35 that he had been at 31, perhaps with more of himself visible now that the years had layered in trust. He was known by every person who worked with him as absolutely reliable. He still trained horses with that quality of patient attention, and his horses had a reputation that brought buyers from 3 counties over. He and Julia had the kind of marriage that people noticed not because it was loud, but because it was real. The way 2 people look at each other across a room, the way they disagree practically and resolve things without theater, the way they take genuine pleasure in each other's presence after years of working side by side. In 1882, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Margaret Ellen, who had Julia's dark hair and Walter's steady temperament, and from her earliest weeks a curiosity about everything she could get her hands on. James, who was 2 years old by then and fully mobile and opinionated, regarded his sister with initial suspicion that converted within a few weeks to a proprietary protectiveness that occasionally required refereeing. Julia's mother came to visit in the fall of 1882, which was a thing Julia had not known she needed until it happened. Her mother arrived on the stage from the railroad with a trunk that was too big and an expression that was trying very hard to manage its expectations. She walked through the farmhouse and the barn and along the edge of the kitchen garden, now in its late-season state, and Julia watched her taking it all in. Her mother said at supper that evening with Walter across the table and little James in his chair and Margaret in Julia's arms, "It's different than I pictured." "Better or worse?" Julia asked. Her mother looked around the table and then at Julia with an expression that was half undone by something she had not expected to feel. "Better," she said quietly. "Much better." Julia reached across the table and took her mother's hand briefly, and her mother held it for a moment. And that was the sum of what needed to be said between them on the subject of Cincinnati and the dish towel and everything else. Her mother stayed for 3 weeks and went home having fallen in love with both grandchildren, having developed a genuine respect for Walter, which Julia had suspected was what was needed for the capitulation to be complete, and having told Julia on the platform waiting for the stage, "You were right. I should have believed you." Julia held her for a long moment and said, "You were scared for me. That's different from not believing me." Her mother pulled back and looked at her with wet eyes and said, "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise," Julia said. "You just couldn't see it over the worry." Her mother laughed in spite of herself, and the stage took her east. In 1883, Walter's brother Henry came from St. Louis to visit, and he and Julia took to each other immediately. Henry being a man of warmth and humor who wore his feelings openly in a way that was the opposite of his brother's more contained style, and which was clearly the product of having had a different experience of the same difficult father. Henry was 27 and employed at a printing company in St. Louis, and was apparently very good at it. He stayed for a month and helped bring in the fall cattle and spent his evenings at the kitchen table talking with Julia about everything from politics to the mechanics of the cider press. And when he left, he said to Walter in Julia's hearing, "She's the best thing that ever happened to you," to which Walter said, "I know," without hesitation. The 1880s moved forward and the territory moved with them, as territories do, fuller, louder, more complicated, more contested. The arguments about land that had always been present became more pointed as the population grew. Julia was not naive about the larger history she was part of, about what it meant that this land had been territory for her purposes and had been something else entirely before. She had arrived in Kansas when the conflicts over land and rights and belonging were still recent and still actively reshaping everything. She had learned from Caldwell's older settlers, from both white and black residents who had come here in the years after the war with their own histories and their own stakes, that the story of the territory was not simple. She had asked questions and listened carefully, in the way she listened to everything, fully and without pretense of having already understood. She was aware that her own claim to her 40 acres was clean in a legal sense and complicated in a larger one, and that awareness made her someone who treated her land and her water and her neighbor's land and water with a scrupulousness that went beyond what was strictly required. Walter shared this quality, which she had known from early on, and which had been one of the things she'd recognized in him as consonant with herself. By 1885, they were known throughout Sumner County as a partnership that worked in every sense of the word. The Rourke operation, which is what people called it, though it encompassed both properties and everything they'd built, was productive and stable. They employed 4 hands year-round and 2 or 3 additional in the high seasons, and they treated their employees fairly in ways that made them among the preferred employers in the county, which meant they rarely lost a good worker. James was 5 and starting his lessons with a schoolteacher who came to the farm 3 days a week, Julia having made the sensible calculation that this was the best arrangement until the school in town was closer. Margaret was 3 and currently devoted to the cider press, with a passion that was either going to result in her running the operation someday or in an accident that would require a doctor. It was sometimes unclear which. Julia was 31 years old and looked exactly like herself, which was to say like a person who had lived fully and worked hard, and was not apologetic about either. Walter was 38, and his hair had started to show silver at the temples in a way that Julia found unreasonably attractive, and told him so with a directness that made him look both pleased and slightly embarrassed. Agnes Polk died in the spring of 1885, quietly, in her sleep, in the boarding house she had run for 15 years. She was 71 years old and had been in good health until the last month, and had continued to serve supper at 6 and not hold it if you were late until the previous November. Julia was with her in her final days, sitting with her in the room she had always kept for herself at the back of the boarding house, and Agnes had talked in her brisk way about things she wanted seen too, and not in a sentimental way that would have been unlike her. On the last afternoon she was fully alert. She took Julia's hand with a surprisingly strong grip and looked at her with those direct dark eyes and said, "You did a good thing coming here. A very good thing." Julia held her hand and said, "I had good help." Agnes made her usual sound of mild dismissal and said, "You did the work, the rest of us just pointed." She died the next morning, and Julia organized her memorial service with the same care she gave to everything she organized. And the church was full because Agnes Polk had fed half of Caldwell at one time or another, and the other half respected her. Julia spoke briefly and well, saying what was true and not more than was needed, which is what Agnes would have wanted. By 1887, the cider operation had grown beyond the small scale Julia had originally intended. She had added a second pressing cycle in the fall, and was selling barrels to merchants in 3 towns. This had been her project independently of the cattle and horses, her own additional thread in the larger work, and she had developed it with the same methodical determination she'd brought to everything since the beginning. There was a satisfaction in it that was distinct from the satisfaction of the main operation, something that had been entirely her vision from the start. She still rode Pemberton, who was now 15 years old and still sound and reliable, though she did not ask him for long fence rides anymore. She had a younger horse for the working rides and kept Pemberton in comfortable semi-retirement, which mostly meant he got the best spots in the corral and an extra portion of feed, and was ridden easily for shorter distances. Walter had once or twice called Pemberton a very well-compensated retiree, and Julia had told him that Pemberton had earned it, which was true. On a clear evening in September of 1887, Julia rode Pemberton out to the east fence line, where she had once sat watching Walter come across the grass toward her after finding the cut wire. The fence was solid now and had been solid for years, and the east pasture held cattle that were her cattle, healthy and fat in the September grass. The sky was enormous in the way that Kansas sky is enormous, going orange at the horizon and darkening to indigo overhead, and the first stars were appearing in the east. She sat on Pemberton at the fence and looked out over the land and felt the weight of 9 years in it. 9 years since the stage had come into Caldwell on a March morning with her and her trunk and her carpetbag and her deed, and her absolute refusal to be diminished. She felt the weight of every fence post that had been driven, and every early morning and every hard day and every small satisfaction, and the enormous satisfaction of all of it together. She felt the weight of Walter, which was not a burden but the best kind of ballast, something that kept the ship steady and moving forward. She heard a horse and looked east along the fence line, and Walter was riding toward her from the direction of their northern pasture. He came up and stopped his horse alongside Pemberton, and they sat together looking at the evening, and the horses stood quietly beside each other, easy in each other's company the way horses become when they have been stabled together for years. "Good evening," he said. "Very good," she said. He looked at the sky for a moment, then at her. "What are you thinking about?" 9 years, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you know what I thought the first morning you came to the corral?" She looked at him. "What?" "I thought you were the most purposeful person I had ever seen in my life." He said it quietly, looking at the sky. "You were standing at that fence, and you had that look in your eyes like the world had better have a very good reason if it was planning to get in your way. And I thought," he paused, choosing his words with his usual care, "I thought, whoever she is going to do whatever she has come here to do. It was simply obvious." She looked at him, this man she had been beside for 9 years, and felt something so large and specific for him that it did not have a simpler word than what it was. "And it never occurred to you to say otherwise," she said. He turned and looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and he said, "Never for a single moment." She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand, and he held hers in both of his the way he had at the creek 9 years ago when the thing between them had been new, and she had been learning the shape of it. "I love you, Walter Rourke," she said. "I love you, Julia Garner," he said, and he said her name with the particular weight he had always given it, as if her name itself was a declaration. The stars were coming out in earnest now, the Kansas sky filling up with them, and the horses were warm and steady beneath them. And the land that Julia had come to the territory to claim and build and hold stretched out around them in the last of the light. 9 years of evidence, and 10 and 20 more years of living still ahead of them, wide open and full and entirely theirs. She squeezed his hand and they turned the horses and rode back toward the lights of the house together, side by side at an easy pace, through the September evening, through the dark grass, through all of it. 3 more years passed, and with them came more of the life they had built together. James at 8 years old was becoming his father's shadow in the corral, watching Walter work with the horses with the same quality of patient attention that Walter had, learning without being formally taught, absorbing it by proximity. Margaret at 6 was as intense as she was cheerful, with opinions on every subject that she delivered with a conviction that Walter said was entirely her mother's and Julia said was entirely her father's, and they were both right. In the spring of 1890, Julia found out she was pregnant again, which she had not been expecting at 36, but which she received with the same practical clarity she brought to everything. Doctor. Fry had left Caldwell 2 years prior for a practice in Wichita, and the new doctor, a Dr. Ansel Croft, was a careful and competent man who told her what she needed to know and not more than she needed to hear. She told Walter on the porch in the April evening, sitting in the chairs they kept on the south-facing side because the evening sun stayed longest there. He listened and looked at her with the same open expression he had shown the first time, that brightness behind the composed exterior. "How are you?" He asked first. "Well," she said, surprised, happy. He reached over and took her hand. He said, "I think we have room." "We have always had room," she said. The third child, another boy, was born in October of 1890, and they named him Thomas, for Thomas Hendricks, who had been Walter's friend and Julia's friend, and had died of a fever in 1888, and was still missed by everyone who knew him, Clara most of all. Clara cried when she heard the name, at supper at the Rourke house when the baby was 2 weeks old, and Julia let her cry and held her hand and poured her more coffee. Thomas Rourke arrived into a house that was full and warm and organized around the principle that work was honorable, and family was the frame of everything, and that both of those things were compatible with a person being fully and specifically themselves. He grew up watching his mother ride fence lines and negotiate cattle prices and press cider, and sit at the kitchen table late in the evening with ledgers and with books. He grew up watching his father train horses with a patience so absolute it seemed like a kind of faith, and watching his parents disagree sometimes and resolve it and laugh sometimes, and work through it, and always choose each other with the same decision renewed in 100 small daily ways. By 1895, the Rourke operation had become one of the most established in Sumner County. The horse training side had grown to the point where Walter's reputation brought buyers from beyond Kansas. The cider operation was profitable enough to have become a real part of the county's economy in its modest way. The cattle were well, the land was well, the house had been extended twice to accommodate growing family and the occasional extended stay of Henry from St. Louis, who came every year and was the children's beloved and somewhat chaotic uncle. Julia was 41 years old. She had lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting into sunlight and from laughing, and her hands were calloused from years of honest work, and she was beautiful in the way that people are beautiful when they are fully alive in their own lives. She had long since stopped keeping count of the people who had told her she would not make it, not because she had forgotten, but because the accounting of it had become as irrelevant as keeping a tally of weather that had passed. She had told the story of her arrival in Caldwell to her children in pieces over the years, not as a moral lesson, but as the true story of their family's beginning. She had told James about the deed in her coat pocket. She had told Margaret about the first morning at the corral. She had told Thomas, who was 5 and absorbed stories with enormous eyes, about Agnes Polk in the porch steps and the door held open. One evening in the fall of 1895, James, who was 15 and already half a horseman thanks to years beside his father, asked her, sitting at the kitchen table over the remains of supper, "Were you ever scared, Mama, when you first came here?" She thought about it honestly. She always thought about questions honestly rather than giving the answer she thought she was supposed to give. "No," she said, "but I was very alone, and there's a difference between scared and alone." He thought about this. What made it better? She looked across the table at Walter, who was listening with his coffee cup in his hands and his eyes quiet and warm. He looked back at her, and she saw in his face everything that 17 years of this had been and would continue to be. "Someone treated me like I was already who I was trying to become," she said, "before I'd proven anything. He just started from there." She paused. "That changes a person." James looked from her to his father and back. At 15, he was old enough to understand more than he would have a few years prior, old enough to recognize something real when he was in the presence of it. Walter set down his coffee cup and said simply, "She would have gotten there either way. I was just there when she did." Julia said, "That's not true, and you know it." Walter said, with the faintest smile, "It's a little true." She reached across the table and touched his hand, and he turned it over and held hers, and the children at the table received this as the entirely ordinary, extraordinary thing it was, the thing that was the whole background of their lives, as unremarkable to them as the sky and as foundational. Outside, the Kansas evening was coming on, and the cattle were settled in the near pasture, and the apple trees were bare with fall, and the cider press in the small shed beside the barn stood waiting for next season, and the horses were in the corral, and Pemberton, 22 now, slow and contented, the most comfortable retiree in Sumner County, stood in the best corner of the barn in his good thick bedding and wanted for nothing. Julia Garner Rourke sat at her kitchen table in the house on the land that she had come to the territory to claim, with her husband's hand in hers and her children around her, and the work of 17 years visible in every direction she could look. And she knew without any qualification, exactly where she had always been trying to go. Not because it was easy, and not because the world had made it easy for her, and not because the people who doubted her had been somehow wrong in a way that could be dismissed, but because she had refused to let their doubt become her own. Because she had come west with a deed and a certainty, and because the territory had proved her right year after year, fence post by fence post, acre by acre, until the proof was so complete that the original doubt seemed like a story about a different world. And because one morning in March of 1878, a woman had come to a livery corral and found a man standing in a horse pen with a roan mare coming to him on her own terms, and he had turned and looked at her face and taken her question at face value, and never, not once in 17 years, said the thing that everyone else had said. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, this man who had been beside her through all of it, and she thought that if she were to try to say what she was most grateful for in the whole of her life, it would not be the land or the cattle or the cider or even the extraordinary fact of having done what she came here to do. It would be this: the particular way he had looked at her from the beginning, as if there had never been a question. The lamp burned warm and yellow on the table between them, and outside the first stars were appearing in the great Kansas sky, and the evening was still and good, and Julia Garner held her husband's hand in the house she had built on the land she had claimed, and she was home in every meaning of the word, closed and completed and full, with years and years more of it still ahead.